Hello, everyone. My name is Edgar Aguirre. I'm a senior economics major, math minor here at Carleton College, primarily studying the economics associated with inequality, and I have the honor of introducing Chuck Collins, who is a storyteller, writer, researcher, and campaigner working to reverse the extreme inequalities of wealth and power and heal the social and ecological harms resulting from social inequities. Collins was born into the wealthiest 1% in the United States, but gave away his wealth at the age of 26 because he didn't want to be a beneficiary of a system of dynastic inherited wealth. He is the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, an iconic brand in the U.S. renowned for its catchy advertising jingles and the Wienermobile. His perspectives about wealth and inheritance are discussed in his popular book, Born on Third Base. A one-percenter makes a case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. He was featured in many interviews, including an NPR Fresh Air interview with Terry Gross and in Sun magazine. In a recent profile in Social Investors, he called on the world's billionaires to establish new metrics for success. It should no longer be the acceleration of assets. It should be social transformation. It should be the elimination of poverty and racial injustice. In a Yes magazine article about wealth advisors that help the rich let go, Collins urged families to redirect their wealth to heal the harms created by the initial extraction of that wealth. His most recent book, The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions, examines the global hidden wealth system and the role of enablers and gatekeepers, such as tax attorneys, wealth managers, and family offices. Collins works to brief foreign reporters about U.S. wealth hiding systems in advance of the publication of the Pandora Papers. He has worked since 1999 on various efforts to organize wealthy people to advocate for progressive tax policies and preserve the federal estate tax, the only tax on inherited wealth. He was co-author with Bill Gates Sr. of Wealth and Our Commonwealth, Why America Should Tax Accumulated Wealth. He also co-authored The Moral Measure of the Economy with Mary Wright, a book about ethics and economic life. Since 2006, he has been director of the Program on Inequality and the Common Good at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the dangers that income disparities pose for the U.S. He is co-founder of Wealth for the Common Good, a network of business leaders, high-income households, and partners working together to promote shared prosperity and fair taxation. This network merged in 2015 with the Patriotic Millionaires, a national network of high net worth individuals advocating for higher taxes on the wealthy, a living wage, and campaign finance reform. Please welcome Chuck Collins to Carleton College.
Thank you, Edgar. I got the chance to talk to one of your senior economics students who's a really impressive person. And we were sort of comparing notes on growing up. He was growing up in the Bronx. I grew up in the, as you heard, in the kind of wealthy suburbs of Detroit. But both of us said, there's something broken here. There's something wrong with this economic system. Anyway, it's great to be with you. Welcome back for those of you who have traveled to be here and come many miles and through this cold weather. So I'm honored to be here. I've never been to Carleton, but I've known about it most of my life, and so may this be a convocation of a new start to a year, to hopefully a better year than the last 2 years we've had. I was looking and realized that in 2022, this year, it will be the 20th anniversary of the loss and death of Senator Paul Wellstone, who was a teacher here for 21 years and wrestling coach and real mentor to me. So when I think of Carleton, I always think about Paul Wellstone. So it's maybe part of this convocation can be thinking about 20 years later, Paul's message to carry it forward. I want to talk with you. The title of the talk is How Do We Reverse Inequality? And we're living through a period of what I would call extreme income and wealth opportunity, extreme racial wealth divisions and divisions of opportunity. But I want to share, I think we are in a kind of a pivotal shift moment. I think that there are some positive signs that I want to share with you and talk about what we can do together. As Edgar said, I won the lottery at birth. My great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer, so I was born in Madison, Wisconsin, not far from here. My dad used to say, bringing home the bacon had a different meaning in our family. And Edgar mentioned the Wienermobile and all this sort of icon. That's what I grew up with, that, knowing that this was my extended family. And actually, one time I was meeting with a group of women religious nuns from an order that had members in the United States and France. And the U.S. sisters said, well, you probably, they were kind of saying, well, Oscar Mayer, you probably haven't heard of Oscar Mayer in France. At which point 30 nuns started to sing the I Wish I Was an Oscar Mayer Wiener jingle and sing it out just to show that it's sort of a earworm of a song and very much part of our culture. So that's what I grew up with. But at when I was, the stage of a Carleton undergraduate student, I worked in Mexico around doing earthquake relief in El Salvador, and grew up in the suburbs of, as I said, the suburbs of Detroit. And there was, the stories that people told me that to explain this gap, this grotesque gap between poverty and concentrated wealth, none of those justifications or explanations really worked for me. And so I gave away the wealth that I received at a young age. And I thought that would be sort of an important turning point, but actually not that much changed, because the way inequality works is people like me who are born with advantage, there's so much, in addition to maybe having access to money or wealth, there's so many other forms of advantage, hundreds of other ways in which the wind is at my back, whether it's growing up white and male and in a U.S. culture, all the advantages that flowed my way. And so even though I became, didn't have wealth, I had all kinds of advantages that I still try to unpack. But one of the things that really shaped me was in my mid-20s, I had a job working with mobile home park tenants who owned their mobile homes but not the land under their parks. And I worked mostly in New England, although there was a great group here in Minnesota called APAC, which was working with tenants to purchase their parks and own them as resident-owned mobile home parks. And so I had this intimate front row seat to people struggling and organizing and fighting to get control over the land and housing that they were living in, and the land under their homes. At the same time, I had this intimate front row seat to affluence, seeing the wealth that had been in my name double in its value between 1980 and 1986 through no effort of my own. And that's what really got me interested in these issues of inequality. How is this possible? And really in the late 70s and 80s is the period at which people start to see that the divide really started to open up, and we're now 40 plus years into this pulling apart. So I want to talk with you about, what's that picture, but even most important, what is it that we can do about it? In the past, I might have brought a big PowerPoint presentation and showed you some slides to the point where you might be begging me to stop. I'm not going to do that. I think, it is important to look at the data, and actually I invite you to check out a website that I co-edit called inequality.org, and we have a new chart pack on just the last year, the inequality in pictures and charts. But let me mention 3 data points just to set the context, because I think most of you are aware of these inequalities we're living in and want to get to the fix let's fix it part of the discussion. The first thing I would just underscore is when we talk about inequality, we're talking about inequality of income, inequality of wealth, inequality of status, inequality of opportunity. There are various forms. What I want to zero in on and invite you to adopt as a lens for this discussion is wealth. Not the annual income, which is important to understand, and the gap between highest paid and lowest paid workers and some of those trends, but wealth, assets, what you own minus what you owe, because that's where you start to see sort of the architecture of multi-generational inequality, which I think is becoming more and more embedded. 3 facts. Since March 2020, 750 billionaires in the United States, that's how many billionaires there are, saw their wealth increase $2.2 trillion. It went from about $3.5 trillion to over $5 trillion. 750 people in less than 2 years have seen their wealth increase $2.2 trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, all the student debt in the United States owed by 43 million households, individual students, is $1.7 trillion. So during the pandemic, there has been a tremendous upsurge in wealth to the top. And that's both in the US and globally. And next week, we're releasing a report with Oxfam looking at the global trends. Data point number 2, the number of households with zero or negative wealth. Wealth being the cushion, what you have to fall back on, reserves, including wealth in a home if you should own a home. If roughly 1 out of 5 households in the United States has zero or negative wealth, and the next 40% has very little. So when people talk about poverty, remember 40% of households have very little by way of financial reserves, sometimes owing more than they own. If you took a racial lens to it, white households, 14% of white households, zero or negative wealth. African American households, 28%, zero or negative wealth. Latino, Latinx households, 26%, zero or negative wealth. So here we have a current picture of who has financial reserves or not, but it is embedded in the multi-generational story of racial inequality, the legacy of racism, and the current reality of racial white supremacy in wealth building. So that's another piece of the picture. The billionaires, surging wealth. The number of households with zero or negative wealth, we'll see if it improves sometime in the next 2 years after the pandemic. Third statistic, $36 trillion. That is the amount of wealth that we estimate is hidden in offshore tax havens, in trusts, in various hidden wealth ownership systems. This is not Uncle Joe with money in the mattress. This is the richest people on the planet, people with $30 million or more, who have hired wealth advisors and attorneys to hide and sequester and put into the shadows roughly 8 to 10% of the world's wealth. We're not going to be able to fix these problems of inequality while there's a growing system where the super wealthy are hiding and sequestering so much wealth and avoiding taxes and accountability and responsibility. And that's the subject of the book that I recently wrote called The Wealth Hoarders, how billionaires pay millions to hide trillions. And that is, I'm leaving a couple copies here for the Carleton Library, but To me, that is the most recent piece of the picture that I've been focusing on, and if anybody wants to talk more about it. But to me, that's the wealth, that's the unbuilt health center. That's the unbuilt pandemic response globally. Before we talk about the fixes, though, I want to just talk a little bit about the harms, which are pretty obvious probably, but there's now, and when I first started doing this work maybe 30 years ago, people would still say, well, okay, that inequality, that's troubling, but does it really matter? Does it really matter how wealthy the wealthy are? Yeah, poverty matters, but should we care about, what's going on with Elon Musk or the billionaires? Now, there's no longer that debate, meaning that there's a mountain of interdisciplinary research. Ask your professors about how these extreme inequalities are undermining everything we care about. Democracy, concentrated wealth in the hands of a few is just devastating our democratic institutions. It was Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis who said, you can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. Social mobility, the American dream, the idea that if you work hard, you can advance. Well, as inequality grows, the social mobility ladder gets stalled out. If you want the American dream and you're not born wealthy, you're better off growing up in Canada or in Northern Europe, where there still is social mobility. But the United States, social mobility is stalled out. Economic health. Some of you may be business majors, concerned about, interested in starting businesses and enterprises. You might feel like the conversation about inequality is kind of an attack on private enterprise. But actually, too much inequality undermines healthy commerce, healthy economic activity. And there's a whole bunch of indicators and research now showing the imbalances are bad for economic growth, bad for economic well-being. So that's part of the harms and I think that these inequalities are part of a larger system. For those of us who are focused on the ecological climate crisis, climate disruption, part of what's happening is these inequalities of wealth and power are preventing our society from responding in the way that we should. Now we have concentrated wealth blocking the changes and reforms that are needed. So these inequalities are part of systems. There's systems of white supremacy, systems of ecological devastation that keep us locked in to a collision course. One of the things, though, that's really interesting is this pandemic, which at the beginning, I would say, was supercharging the existing inequalities, meaning that the advantaged have seen their wealth accelerate, and the people who came in with no financial reserves were more precarious, more at risk, more vulnerable. But we're also getting some clues, because in the response to the pandemic, we've been experimenting with things like the child tax credit, which has helped lift millions of children out of poverty. We've begun to engage in experimenting with what would a guaranteed income look like in certain places. So that's I think positive. And I think this awareness that inequality and the unequal experience of people during the pandemic has seeded, I think, the next transformational social movements that will ultimately reverse these inequalities. I believe there is a realignment in progress. So, what can we do about these extreme inequalities? The first thing I would do is say, let's see what we can learn from the rest of the world. Why is it that certain countries and societies have much less inequality than the United States? And we can even learn from our own history to some extent, why was it that the United States started to reduce inequality in the 30 years after World War II. 1945 to the mid-70s, the wage gap started to narrow. The racial wage gap started to narrow. The middle class saw their real incomes rise. There was racial discrimination in terms of home ownership and wealth building, but on top of that, still, some of the gaps were narrowing from 1945 into the mid-60s. 1969, 1975 were the relatively most equal periods of the last century in terms of income and wealth ownership. But then we turned and went a different way. What was it about that time? What is it about the Scandinavian, Nordic countries and their inequalities? What makes them different? And I would argue there are three really important pieces. One is they have a high floor, they have a social safety net. Two, they invest in things that give people opportunity. And three, they put a brake on the concentration of wealth and power. So the first part, raising the floor, they have a higher social safety net, a higher decency floor. And some of the rule changes, and I think it's very important to talk about how do we change the rules that worsen inequality. Think of it almost like turning the dials to rewire the economy to create different outcomes. So raise the floor, raise the minimum wage, create sort of support for low and income people where people cannot fall into destitution. A decency floor. That's one integral component of societies like Denmark or Sweden that have less inequality. They have a higher floor. The second thing those societies do, and that the United States started to do, was invest in expanded opportunity, access to college, higher education and without debt, universal access to health insurance. You know, if you're in Denmark, you not only don't have student debt, you get a stipend while you're in college to pay your living expenses. Imagine. Access to health insurance so that health or illness doesn't make somebody destitute. Investments in early childhood education and early childhood supports, daycare and support. All these things help non-wealthy people have opportunity and access to decent lives. So that's the other key component of reducing inequality. The third, and probably the most politically controversial, is limiting the accretion of wealth at the top, limiting concentrations of wealth, usually through progressive taxes. Income above a certain level is taxed at a higher rate. Wealth, in some cases, is taxed. Monopolies and concentrations of ownership and corporate power are broken up through antitrust policy. Incentives for broader ownership and worker ownership, things that spread the wealth around so more people have access to them. Those are the components. Raise the floor, address opportunity, and limit the concentration of wealth. And I recommend a book, actually, if you're interested. George Lakey wrote a book called Viking Economics, looking at the Nordic economic systems and why they're different. But if I was going to summarize on a bumper sticker, why have these inequalities grown in the last 40 years? It's because the rules of the economy have been changed. The dials have been turned to benefit wealth owners, asset owners, at the expense of wage earners. Tax policy, good for wealth holders, shifting tax obligations onto wages. Global trade treaties that boost share prices for investors but undermine wage standards for workers. Those are the rules of the economy. And so we need to look at things that raise the floor, level the playing field, and reduce concentrated wealth and power. So here's the good news. There is a public ready for change. When people are surveyed and asked what kind of society they want to live in, what kind of level of taxation, what kind of levels of inequality they think are tolerable, they describe Sweden. People in the United States want to live in Sweden. Now, I know people in Minnesota, some of them think they're in Sweden, but the rest of society wants to not have these extreme levels of inequality. And in the last 2 years, I have seen a revolutionary shift in public attitudes towards taxing the very wealthy. We have historically a pretty high tolerance for inequality in the United States. And because of the pandemic, because of the understanding that the wealthy are not paying their fair share of taxes, because of exposés like the Pandora Papers that I worked on and others, people are coming around. 75, 80% of the population believe wealthy people should be paying much higher taxes, and that money should be invested in the things that reduce inequality and reduce poverty. We're up against a couple of important, powerful forces that use their wealth and power to block change. And if you've been paying attention politically the last couple months, Congress is trying to pass something called Build Back Better. It started off as almost a $4 trillion public investment package. It would be doing all kinds of green infrastructure, addressing climate mitigation, climate change. It would expand this child tax credit and extend it so that millions of children would be lifted out of poverty. It would build a modern daycare system in the United States and invest in early childhood education. It would do what I described. It would raise the floor. It would plug holes in our health insurance system for those who still don't have access. It would raise the decency floor. It would radically make investments to extend opportunity. And it would be paid for entirely by increasing taxes on people with incomes over $400,000, and in many cases on people with incomes over $10 million. That is what is being blocked. That's what the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, walked away from the table, because the Senate, it passed the House, it got negotiated down and shrunk into a shrivel, half of what it is, but still a meaningful half. And now that's what's hanging in the balance. And actually the one thing that I would encourage and invite you to do, wherever you come from, wherever you are, is to weigh in, whether it's a letter to the editor or a communication with an elected official saying, let's move Build Back Better. There is nothing that's on the table that would affect these inequalities more in the immediate term than the passage of Build Back Better. But there's lots of other things that we can be doing and setting the stage for. And I guess I would like to invite you to think about three different actions categories of action. One is bring that lens of wealth inequality, and particularly the concentration of wealth and power, to your understanding of the world. So if you think about the affordable housing crisis in many areas, understand that the concentration of wealth and power is distorting and upending and disrupting our housing markets. It's disrupting the democratic institutions in our society. It's polarizing our culture and society. And that wealth inequality is a place where we can make a difference. That these huge concentrations of wealth, some of which are hidden, are the treasure, are the resources of our society that we need to bring back home and invest in fixing the future. The second is to look at the stories that hold inequality in place. We as a society have these powerful narratives. I talk to people all the time about inequality, and I'm on talk radio, and people call in and say, well, these inequalities may be troubling, but if you tax this wealthy person over there, that's going to be harmful to them. And by the way, they created that wealth, and so-and-so invented this useful thing, and if we tax that person, that's going to harm the whole society. And there's a very powerful, what I would call the narrative of deservedness, which is, again, on a bumper sticker, that when people look at these inequality statistics, what's in their mind is, oh, people are where they deserve to be. So if you have multi-umpteen millions of dollars, you must work hard, get up early, apply yourself, work, take risks, and there may be some truth in some of that. But the corollary to that is if you're struggling economically, it's because you deserve to be where you are too. You're not working hard, you don't get up early in the morning. The oil billionaire J. Paul Getty was once asked, how do you become wealthy in America? And he said, it's actually quite simple. We can even do a poll here. He said, the first thing is you have to get up early every morning. How many people got up early here this morning? Good. Number 2, work hard all day, including going to a convocation lecture on your own time. Yeah. 3, find oil. No, vegetable oil didn't count. No, sorry. So that's that story. Some people get up early, work hard all day. The story of meritocracy, the mythology of deservedness really holds these inequalities in place. It's one of the things that keeps people from thinking critically about the rules and how the rules are rigged or tipped in favor of those with advantage. And I really learned about how to disrupt these narratives from Bill Gates's dad. I was working on a campaign to try to keep the estate tax, our inheritance tax, from being abolished. And I got a call, and my coworker said, it's Bill Gates. And I'm like, yeah, this is a crank call. But it was Bill Gates Sr. And he had this rap. He would say, well, my son and all these wealthy people, they work hard, but they also didn't do it alone. They benefit from living in a society where we make investments together, where we build wealth and knowledge together, where we build a whole infrastructure, a fertile ground that makes wealth possible. Individuals matter, but what we do together as a society matters too. And through the groups like Bill Gates Sr. and others, there's a whole new, different narrative around wealth creation that isn't what I would call the great man theory of wealth creation. I did it alone, I'm a hero, but looking at the web and the way that we as societies create wealth together. So telling true stories, disrupting the narrative of deservedness is something that each of us can do in our individual lives, and in the public arena. When we hear these narratives that justify the racial gap, the wealth gap. The third thing I want to invite you to do is find a way to take action. Inevitably someone will ask me, what is it that an individual can do to address these inequality problems? And the answer is not much. Not much as a sole solitary individual. You have to be part of something bigger. You have to be part of a student group. You have to be part of a civic group. You have to be part of a union or association. You have to find others to work together to exercise your power. Individual action does make a difference, but find others and support one another to take meaningful action. And take action on these inequality issues in a way that touches you. Here's a couple quick examples. First, I mentioned Build Back Better, but you are hereby deputized in the next week to do something to push Build Back Better. And most people don't understand what's in it, so one thing is just to understand what's at stake. The window is open for another 15 minutes to get something meaningful, I mean, maybe for the next 8 months, to get something meaningful to reverse these inequalities. This is the best shot we have. 2 years ago, we didn't have a shot like this. That is the most important on-the-table policy thing. But let's just take the issue of student debt. Some of you may be looking ahead to having student debt. Some of you, for various reasons, may not. But this is a generational equity issue. And I encourage you to come together, cross-class, cross-race, and work to find a national solution, a executive order. President Biden could pass certain executive orders that would begin to chip away at the student debt debacle. And if there's anybody here that's over 50 or 60, they can tell you about the days when people went to college without going into indentured servitude in the United States. It was not that long ago. It doesn't have to be this way. It is because powerful interests and forces of inequality have organized to pick your pockets. $1.7 trillion of student debt, 43 million individuals. That is a political force, could be a political force. It doesn't have to be that way. Here we are in chapel. This is my one and only call and response. It doesn't have to be that way. Okay, one more time. It doesn't have to be this way. That's one that's maybe personal or maybe relevant to your family. And if for some reason you have the good fortune or the institutions come through for you, and this is not about Carleton, this is a systemic issue of this issue of student debt. If we organize people with student debt to be a political force to speak out and change this, that would have a huge impact. The racial wealth divide that I mentioned at the beginning, it's a multi-generational, we're talking about 40 years of inequality and 400 years of white supremacy. But when we look at wealth, there are things that are on the table that people are doing to narrow that divide. And you can check out at inequality.org. We have a whole section of actions. But this whole idea of what about savings, universal savings accounts, or access to home ownership, or various forms of reparations that both invest in institutions and in individuals, that will make a huge difference. And finally, taxing the top. People don't like to talk about taxes, but taxes are the way in which we are going to recapture this wealth of the commons. And moving the wealth out from the shadows and all these hidden wealth systems is absolutely key. So whatever you're doing, pay attention to these tax conversations, focusing on taxing the ultra-wealthy, reinvesting those funds in a way. The tax system has become almost optional for the most ultra-wealthy people in our society. Just look over the last year at the exposés, the amount of wealth hidden to the shadows, the amount of wealth that is avoided through trusts and other mechanisms. The estate tax that I worked so hard to save with Bill Gates as senior, last year, a tax that only is applied to the wealthy at the end of life, raised $9 billion, which is nothing. President Trump's Secretary of Economics said only morons pay the estate tax, basically because the ultra-wealthy have figured out how to avoid it. So that's got to be part of our agenda. So let me close by just saying we are at the moment where we're starting to reverse these inequality. The public opinion is there. the pressure from below is building, there is a possibility for realignment. That's not to say that the ultra-wealthy are going to use their wealth and power to block change. And I should say there are allies among the ultra-wealthy. Check out the Patriotic Millionaires, this network that we helped start. That's hundreds and hundreds of high net worth individuals speaking out, saying, increase our taxes. The seeds of a movement to reverse inequality are emerging. They are webbed with sectors. Students are a critical part of that. Workers, seniors, unions, business groups. We need to sort of build that grassroots power. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of these inequalities. It has made our society more fragile, more ill-prepared. The inequalities that we entered the pandemic with are one of the reasons why we're not able to stop it in the way we had. And so in the spirit of Paul Wellstone, let's carry it forward and make 2022 a pivotal year in reversing extreme inequality. Thank you. And,
thank you very much, Chuck, for being here. And we are going to have time for question and answer. However, I want to steal the spotlight for a second, if I may, just to thank you all for being here. It's really cold outside. I appreciate your being here today. I also want to mention, as far as the Convocation program goes, if you're unfamiliar with it, if this is your first time, please go to carleton.edu, type in Convocation, and see how you can be involved with the convocations going forward, the Convocation luncheons, being a part of the process. We'd love to hear from you, so please feel free to do that. In the meantime, I've got a microphone. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and I'll be happy to pop around, and we'll field your questions. And don't be shy.
don't be shy. Any question, any topic. And I welcome challenging questions. If you disagree with anything, let's have the discussion.
Well, I just like to think that we all have dribbled our money towards these guys at the top by buying into whatever it is they're selling. Do you ever add that to your talk as a way of affirming we deserve more back from them as we're busy making the world safe for their commerce?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, you know, there's a stage in economics people talk about when the economy becomes a rent extraction economy. And if you think about how many nickels and dimes float up from our pocketbooks and wallets and whatever to your cell phone bill, your cable bill, your online delivery, this, you know, that actually isn't really the productive economy, the real economy of goods and services and food and things, and how much is just being kind of tolls that are being extracted as we go through our days. And I think that's something I would encourage us to be aware of, and also think about as consumers. You know, the more you can, you know, you vote with your dollars. This is just one part of what we need to do, but how we vote with our dollars in terms of what we buy, where we buy it, what kinds of organizations and ownership, you know, institutions is the thing that produced this. Does it have a broad worker ownership, or is it, you know, all the money going to a few absentee shareholders? So yeah, I think that, and part of the rationale, and Bill Gates Sr. used to say this when he talked about why the wealthy should pay taxes, is look, without, you know, we created this fertile ground for wealth creation together as a society. Consumers, communities, marketplaces, goods are transported over public infrastructure. The internet is public infrastructure. These are all things that we've built together, and wealthy people may have created value, or somebody may have started an enterprise that created value, but they don't get to claim ownership of all the value. And that's a point that he made.
Hi. I was wondering do you think in an ideal world would billionaires exist in the first place?
So glad you asked that question, because in the last 2 years you've seen, you know, there have been articles Abolish Billionaires. And I don't particularly think that's the most useful framing because it has a little bit of a whiff of exterminism, if you will, like but what I would say is we should have an economy where not so much wealth is being funneled upwards, We're on track to have, the first trillionaire within a decade. I mean, the top-heavy nature of society is a problem. And so billionaires are a symptom of a broken system where too much of society's wealth is going into too few hands. And that's where we should rewire it. So, and I would say, and if you look at the last 40 years, and particularly the last 20 years, most of the income and wealth gains have not just gone to the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. And then within that, the biggest gains have gone to the centimillionaires up to the billionaires. So even within the top 10%, more of the gains are going up. So that's just, again, it's a great example of the system is broken. Part of what we should do is tax wealth, but we should also pre-distribute that wealth. The billions that are going into the hands of a few are the underpaid wages, are the monopoly control over marketplaces, are the lack of sharing the wealth with workers who help create the value. So you want to pre-distribute the wealth with broader ownership, higher wages, and then if wealth does accumulate to these billion-dollar levels, a much more progressive tax system. So a wealth tax. We have this inheritance tax I mentioned, the estate tax, which only is applied to couples now at this point with $23 million or more. Okay, so anybody here who has less than $23 million, or a single individual with less than 12 million, you're not going to pay the estate tax or the death tax. That's the tax I mentioned that has become optional. But that's a tax at the end of life. What about an annual wealth tax? A 2%, as Elizabeth Warren proposed, 2% on wealth 50 million and up. 3% or 4% on wealth a billion and up. It's not going to change anybody's life at the top, but it would raise substantial revenue. So, we want to have a society where there are no billionaires. And if they accidentally pop up, we tax it away. That's what I believe. And it's not just also about revenue, it's about saving democracy from concentrated power. That's the key here.
So you've mentioned some policies such as instituting an increasing minimum wage. So one of the common criticisms of instituting a price floor on the wage market would be the sort of decrease in employment, and thus, since there is a difference in supply and demand, we would have more nepotism in the job hiring market. How would you respond to that, and what is your justification for increasing the minimum wage, and to what extent do you want to do that?
Yeah, I think first of all, the minimum wage now, I think we're at the 12-year anniversary mark of the federal minimum wage has not been raised in 12 years. It's still $7.25. But there are many states that have state-level minimum wages, like Minnesota, where sometimes it's where I live, but still, half the states in the United States only have a federal minimum wage. So, and the tipped minimum wage for people who work in restaurants, anybody know? $2.35 or so? Yeah. So $2.35. So now every time there's a proposal to raise the minimum wage or just index it to inflation, there are studies that come out showing that it might have a marginal impact on employment. That's at the very, there's certain businesses where, you're going to have 5 employees and you're only going to be able to have 4 or something like that. I would just check out, Economic Policy Institute has done all the analysis showing it's not going to have this adverse effect. We have raised the minimum wage in years past, doesn't create an increase in unemployment. And it has a positive bump up effect on the whole economy. Putting money in workers' pockets has a positive stimulus effect on the economy. We've just learned that during the pandemic. The only reason the economy didn't tank a year and a half ago during the first phase of the pandemic was because we basically boosted people's earnings and we put money in people's pockets. That's what raising the minimum wage does. And there's a great business case. If you're a high road business owner, if you have a business and you want, it's very hard to compete against a low road business that's competing on lower wages. If you raise the wage floor, then you compete on other things other than who's going to pay less. And that creates and encourages the high road businesses to flourish. So I think there's a lot of really good economic and moral arguments for phasing in a much higher minimum wage. But thank you for that question. Good question.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the concerns about taxation and the efficacy of taxation as like the main pillar of redistributing elite wealth, mostly in the context of like the potential failure of policies like the Build Back Better bill. How do we guarantee that if we're generating this revenue from increasing taxes to the wealthy, that this money isn't then being funneled into like increasing our millions of dollars or trillions of dollars that the government is spending on military, as opposed to actually redistributing this through social infrastructure? And like, will taxation be effective for generating revenue if the government isn't capable of using that revenue in socially productive ways? And how do we address that?
Yeah. One thing that's interesting that's in the Build Back Better is a recognition that the Internal Revenue Service, the tax oversight body, has been decimated in its ability to monitor the wealth shell games of the super rich. So there was actually investing in enforcement looking at the very high end of tax avoidance. That's part of the plan. But your question is a bigger question, which I would just say, there's how do we have a fair tax system that raises revenue from those with the greatest ability to pay, that doesn't overburden wage earners, that taxes wealth and capital, not just income. And then there's the question of what do we spend it on? What are the budget priorities? And we have a political system that's been hijacked by big money and has distorted the spending priorities. So in some ways it's two arenas of struggle. One is to, and oftentimes they have to be linked together, but in fact we don't have federal earmarking. I mean, we have like the highway tax, the gas tax goes to highways, or a few things like that, but we don't get to say that dollar that's raised here can only be spent over here and not here. And ultimately it's a democracy thing. It's a democracy challenge. How can we, the people, influence the priorities? I mean, the beauty of something like Build Back Better is it sets in place this framework and these spending initiatives, and it identifies the revenue to pay for them. But it doesn't, we still waste tons of money on Pentagon spending. That's part of how we need to rewire the system. So we need to be engaged in the fights about how the money is spent. But independent of that, we need a fair tax system. So you can speak out for a fair tax system, knowing that you don't always win every spending and battle, if you will.
Hello, thank you for coming. Just briefly, when you talk a little bit about the idea of voting with your dollar, how do you think consumers can balance that with more generally the type of institutional change you spoke a little bit about?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate the vote with your dollars thing, because that becomes like so much of a focus. Whereas I think you're right. We need to be thinking about larger systemic change, of which how we consume and what we reinforce through our consumption is just one component of it. Yesterday we marked the anniversary of what could have been a disruption to the peaceful transfer of political power. I'm here. I'm invited to talk about reversing inequality, but I care about economic and ecological disruption and the plight of our democracy right now. To me, these are all integrated systems, but this corrosive concentration of wealth and power is kind of like, I think of it like we're in a car and we're on autopilot and the steering wheel is locked and we're heading to the precipice, and the wealth and power, the richest people on the planet are controlling that steering wheel, and the rest of us are trying, in the back seat, hollering, no, no. And actually, I think that is why focusing on reducing the concentration of wealth and power is a kind of integral pressure point in fixing the whole system failure. We're on the verge of interlocking system failures, and this is just one of many important places into that. And I keep bringing up Build Back Better because, again, where else are we going to spend $1 trillion on green infrastructure in the next 3-5 years, So to those of us who care about and see the disruption, the ecological disruption emerging, that's a key intervention. And a lot of it has to sort of move in tandem, protecting our democracy. So it's interesting to see, okay, what is it that we do in the next month? Well, clearly, voter reform, voter protection, the Voter Protection Act, all these things that are around, because we're looking ahead, 8-10 months toward a potential political shift where things will be even more gridlocked, and the possibility for transformational change will be temporarily blocked again. The one good news is the pressure from below is consistent. People don't want to go over the cliff. And people don't want these extreme inequalities. There's a segment of wealth and power that are blocking change, but that's not the majority. So it is about reasserting the will of the people. That's where, Thank you for that question, though.
I think we have time for one last question, which I've been told is a short one, and here we go.
My answer might not be short. No, I'm just kidding.
It seems as if these present trends are going to continue. How much time do we have before we do go over the cliff?
Well, I'm not, I think we basically, if you think about ecologically speaking, we're kind of, there's certain points of no return we've already passed, in terms of, but there are things that we can still do. We have agency, we have some ability to address that. In terms of inequality, my view is each year that we stay on this current trajectory, the ruts of inequality deepen, the ruts of persistent poverty and the ruts of concentrated wealth and power. It was Thomas Piketty who said, if we just stay on this trajectory, a generation from now, we will have a hereditary aristocracy of wealth and power, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics. I think the next 5 years are absolutely critical in terms of both the ecological and economic challenge. And, I think that I invite you all to say, well, that's going to be part of that's part of each of our lives, is figuring out how to most effectively exercise our gifts, whatever they are. If you're an artist, if you're a performer, if you're a photographer, if you're a poet, if you're an activist, join active, engaged civic life. This is, none of us are going to find like a cool ninja maneuver around this where we're going to opt out and find a better individual path. I say that about student debt. Some people think about student debt and think, I got it covered. But no, these need to be shared or collective solutions. So, I think this year is critical because the window is slightly open at the national level for political change. There's still lots of things that can happen at the state and local and international level. But in terms of US politics, the next 8 months are absolutely key in getting some of these rule changes through that help us begin to turn the corner. So that's my best answer on sense of time is, as they say, when's the best time to plant an oak tree 40 years ago? Next best time is now. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Did you have a final comment or? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your
Indeed.
attention.
Thank you. And that concludes this convocation. We'll see you next week.